What if the person you looked down on refused to stay silent? Daniel Reed was about to teach one woman and an entire neighborhood that respect is a two-way street. Daniel Reed was a well-known, well-loved figure in Maplewood, a peaceful, diverse neighborhood where he had lived for nearly a decade. Known for his warmth and generosity, Daniel spent his time volunteering at the community center, organizing local events, and helping neighbors in any way he could. People respected him, and he respected them. One warm afternoon, Daniel stopped by his favorite cafe to grab a coffee before heading home. He stepped outside, greeting familiar faces as he sipped his drink. But as he made his way down the sidewalk, he accidentally brushed shoulders with Linda Hayes, a long-time Maplewood resident. Linda was known for her sharp tongue and haughty demeanor, but today she took her hostility to a new level. Daniel, who was always polite, immediately said, "Oh, excuse me, ma'am," and offered a friendly smile. But her reaction was instant and shockingly hostile. Linda's face twisted with annoyance and disdain. She glared at him as if he'd committed some unforgivable offense. "Watch where you're going!" she snapped, her voice full of contempt. The disdain in her tone was palpable, and her words felt like an intentional slap in the face. Daniel, taken aback but still courteous, said, "I'm very sorry, Mom. It was an accident." Linda's face only hardened as she took a step closer. Her voice grew louder so that the people around them could hear. "People like you shouldn't even be in a neighborhood like this," she sneered, looking him up and down with barely concealed disgust. Her words stung. Daniel knew exactly what she meant, and it wasn't the first time he'd encountered prejudice, but rarely had he seen it expressed so openly, so boldly in his own neighborhood. He felt anger bubble up inside, but forced himself to remain calm. This was his home, his community, and he wouldn't allow anyone to make him feel like he didn't belong. "Mom, I've lived in Maplewood for years," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "I belong here as much as anyone." Linda's face reddened with anger, her voice now dripping with venom. "I don't care how long you've been here. You people think you can just take over every place you step foot in. You come in, push everyone else out, and act like you own it." A few people nearby began to notice the exchange. Heads turned as Linda's angry voice echoed down the street. Some passers-by slowed their pace, curious about the commotion, while others paused, sensing the escalating tension. Linda's voice only grew louder, as if she was playing to the crowd, looking for validation. "You people always think you're entitled to everything," she sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Daniel's heart pounded. He knew he'd done nothing wrong, but Linda's words cut deeply. He took a steadying breath, determined to stand his ground. "Ma'am, I haven't disrespected you. I'd appreciate the same respect in return." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Respect? You think you deserve respect?" She nearly laughed, her face twisted in a sneer. "People like you don't know the meaning of respect." It was then that she did the unthinkable. Linda reached out and shoved him with both hands, pushing him back a few steps. "You don't belong here!" she shouted, her voice laced with rage. The small crowd gasped, and several onlookers pulled out their phones to record the encounter. Daniel took a step back, his face a mixture of shock and anger. He looked her in the eye, his voice calm but firm. "Respect is something everyone deserves, regardless of where they come from or what they look like." Linda scoffed, unrepentant. "You're lucky I don't call the police. You wouldn't stand a chance if I did." Her words were a thinly veiled threat, and Daniel could feel his frustration boiling over. But before he could respond, a voice from the crowd broke through. "Actually, Linda, we all know Daniel, and he's done more for this neighborhood than you ever have." The voice belonged to Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman who had lived in Maplewood her entire life. She stepped forward, her gaze unwavering as she looked at Linda. "Daniel has been helping at the shelter, coaching kids, organizing events. He's one of the best people in this community." Linda's face flushed, clearly taken aback. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up for Daniel, let alone in public. She looked around, but instead of finding support, she saw only disapproving faces. People whispered and shook their heads, their expressions filled with disappointment. "Linda, I've seen Daniel do more for this neighborhood in 1 month than you've done in your entire life," another voice chimed in. Mr. Johnson, a local shop owner, joined Mrs. Harper. "People like him are what make Maplewood special. We don't need people who spread hate." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Linda's face turned pale. She tried to argue, her voice faltering as she said, But he was harassing me. He wouldn't leave me alone." Her blatant lie only deepened the crowd's disapproval. Just then, another figure approached, a tall man in uniform. Officer Samuel Taylor, a well-known and respected policeman, had arrived after hearing the commotion. He assessed the situation, his gaze settling on Linda, and then on Daniel. "Is there a problem here?" Officer Taylor asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Linda's eyes lit up, thinking she'd been given a lifeline. She pointed at Daniel, her voice shrill. "Yes, Officer Taylor, this man was harassing me, wouldn't leave me alone." The crowd gasped again, many of them shaking their heads in disbelief, but Officer Taylor wasn't buying it. He had known Daniel for years and wasn't fooled by Linda's act. He looked directly at her, his face stern. "Linda, I know Daniel very well," he said, his voice steady. "He's been a respected member of this community for years, and I've never seen him do anything but good for the people here. If anyone here is causing trouble, it's not him." Linda's face fell, her confidence crumbling. She tried to stammer a response, desperate to save face. I just thought he looked suspicious." Officer Taylor's eyes darkened, and his voice grew colder. "Suspicious? For walking out of a coffee shop?" He took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "Linda, this community deserves better than your hateful assumptions." She looked around, hoping for support, but found only disapproving faces. Every person in the crowd was watching her, and the weight of their judgment bore down on her. She was alone in her prejudice, exposed for everyone to see. Mrs. Harper stepped forward again, her voice strong and clear. "Linda, maybe you should think about what it means to be a part of a community before you start treating others like they don't belong." Linda's shoulders slumped, realizing she had lost. She glanced at Officer Taylor, who shook his head in disappointment. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her head hung low, disappearing down the street. As she left, the crowd began to applaud, not just for Daniel, but for the strength of their community in standing against hate. Mrs. Harper and Mr. Johnson approached Daniel, their faces filled with warmth and gratitude. "Thank you, Daniel," Mrs. Harper said, giving him a gentle squeeze on the arm. "You reminded all of us of what it means to be part of Maplewood." Officer Taylor put a hand on Daniel's shoulder, offering a reassuring nod. "Thank you for handling this with grace, Daniel. It's people like you who make this neighborhood what it is." Daniel left that day with his head held high, feeling a deep sense of pride and belonging. He had stood up, not just for himself, but for the values of the community he cherished. From that day forward, the people of Maplewood remembered this moment as a turning point, a day when unity and kindness triumphed over prejudice. And as Linda walked away, she carried with her the weight of her actions, a reminder that in Maplewood, respect and kindness were values that weren't up for negotiation. Thank you for watching this story. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories about resilience and respect. Let's continue to celebrate and support communities that stand up for each other.